Let's do this. Hey guys, good to see everybody again, even though I actually can't see you this morning. It's Jake McKenzie with the Intermark Group. We're the nation's largest psychology-driven marketing firm. And with me, as always, is Dr. David Pridwell, our chief people scientist and one of the PhDs we have on staff here, and the one that enjoys being on camera, I guess. Back when I was a kid, my mom often talked about taking stock of what reality is, even when we don't want to hear it. And sometimes in marketing, we've got to do that as well. And there's this one tough thing that all marketers need to acknowledge. And that's why we love our industry, like really love our industry. I enjoy watching ads and enjoy seeing what everybody else is doing. The general public does not. In fact, surveys show only about 12% of people report liking advertising. They enjoy sitting down and watching ads. Everybody else views it as a nuisance. They want to fast forward. They're going to screen surf during the whole time. And they're actively trying to avoid consuming our content. And that leads to some really bizarre outcomes where people don't remember our ads. They don't think about it like we do. So we want to talk about that a little bit today, as well as some of the implications for marketing. Given that people don't really love ads, how do we get through in that space? How do we get them to pay attention to us? So in short, how do we get noticed? Well, let's start, as we always do, quick bit about Intermark. We are the nation's largest psychology-driven marketing firm, headquartered out of Birmingham, Alabama, offices in Atlanta and Tampa. And we help companies grow faster by applying research and psychology. We've been blessed to work with some of the biggest, coolest brands all across the country. What they all have in common is they are outperforming their competition. And it's because we're applying research and psychology to help get better outcomes. Now, what we do is like most ad agents, we supply marketing and we do everything under the marketing sun. So our team works with TV, radio, outdoor, digital, display ads, building websites and apps, and all the things that you might do in the entire marketing space. I mentioned that so there's your framing your questions, which you can put in the friendly Q&A section or in the chat feature, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. Feel free to ask about anything. We'd like to take this and take these concepts and put it in a way that you can make your marketing better starting tomorrow. So today's overall agenda, we're going to focus on our attention being super limited and really look at the research related to that. But most importantly, what do you do about it? How do you make your marketing get noticed? And there are four major principles that we're going to cover off on today. They are being clear at a distance. Number two, make meaning out of your advertising, understanding how the brain processes information. Number three is have your content be motivating. And then lastly, focusing on the little things within our creative that often get overlooked. Then we're going to do something that we think you're going to like. We're going to put this into a framework, a checklist, if you will, so that you can take your own marketing and put it through this checklist to make sure that it's going to be increasingly effective. Now, we can't cover everything. This is way too much content for a 1-hour session. So send us some questions and we'll get into the meat of them. But we start, as we always do, with a key piece of research. You know, people don't like marketing, but it leads to a really bizarre outcome. When people watch ads, and in this case, we're talking about TV ads, because those are the highest engagement level content that we are producing in the ad space. 1 week later, a scant percentage of people actually remember the ads. So only 16% of people will remember both the ad and who it was for. That means 84% of all marketing is forgotten within 1 week. Now, holy cow, man, that's kind of depressing for me. And I love this space, but it also makes me think, how do we get into that 16%? How do we make sure that all of the content we produce is remembered and associated with the brand that we want it to be remembered by, i.e., let's get the most for our money. We don't want to fall into that 84%. So let's get into talking about that and see how we can improve things. Right, David?
Yeah, there's, two pieces here. One is let's accurately understand how customers engage in advertisements and how they view products. But then let's also understand how they process information in general, which leans into customer psychology and the brain and how we perceive the world. So as Jake said, talking about how we forget the majority of ads that we see, that's an important piece to understanding how our advertisements and our marketing materials will be viewed. So it's estimated that 43% of TV ads are viewed. So not all of them reach somebody who's in the room, who's watching and paying attention to that ad. And when they are viewed, they're typically attended for 14 seconds. So about half the duration of a typical TV ad. For a point of purchase, the same situations apply. Where customers typically spend between 12 and 17 seconds considering products when they're looking for them at the grocery store. So if you're looking for an olive oil there, you might spend between 12 and 17 seconds among them before you make your decision. But the point is, you're not seeing every product. You're not looking at every olive oil and reading everything about what's in it. You're going to make some relatively quick decisions. And in general, this is actually even quicker when we're looking at how people make purchases online.
And one cautionary piece there, those scant 12 seconds are not really spent just thinking about your brand. They're thinking, is this the right product? Is this the right size? What is the price? And is there a deal going on? So the amount of mental resources we put towards brand association is a whole lot less than we spend thinking about it within the industry. I know it's your brand. I know it's your business. You spend a lot of time thinking about it. Our customers aren't. So when they are attuned, we've got to make sure that we are clear at a distance. And what we mean by this is within that tiny window of time where they are paying attention to your ad, your message, whether it be print, radio, TV, digital, or a social media post, you got to capture them. And how do we capture that attention? So let's start by understanding what people are actually seeing and perceiving, because I think that's going to surprise some of you.
Yeah. And so we need to appreciate that there's much more information going on in the world than our senses can accurately capture. And you could see that this is pretty well displayed in this image. If you were in this sort of scene, there would be a lot that would be happening that you wouldn't be able to process and understand. And we know that when we're in a crowded room, we can't make out all the conversations that are happening at the same time. So there's limited information that are captured by our eyes and our ears and all of our senses. But even the information that is captured by our brain and by our sensory systems, the brain can't process all that information. It can't attend to all of it and bring it into conscious perception and act upon all of it. So it has to be very selective in how it makes a quick decision at determining which information to bring through and engage upon and which information to discard. And so it turns out that when we think about how we build a picture of the world and what customers see, and even when we acknowledge all of these limitations, the limitations are even more than we typically think of. So this is what we typically think that we experience when we look at the world. We think that our brain is capturing this sort of photographic image of the scene, but that's not actually the input that comes in. What comes in is more like this, where the location where our eyes fixate has a very fine grasp and fine detail of what it's looking at. But all that outer portion is processed outside of that focal point, and it's actually blurry. And so this is what's coming into the brain. And we don't actually see the world that way. And it's perplexed vision scientists for decades. Some of them spend their whole career trying to figure out, why do we think that we have an accurate picture of the world when that's not what's coming into our brain? And it's because the brain has to fill in that missing information and construct a coherent, cohesive reality for us out of incomplete information.
We've all experienced this phenomenon, like we're looking for something, maybe it's the car keys or something in the fridge. And until you ask your spouse where it is, and then it magically appears immediately in front of you, you realize our visual system is hyper limited. We're not taking in everything. And sometimes it takes an external trigger to get us to see something that's right in front of us, even when we're looking for it. So take those two concepts. The brain is actively filtering out things to ignore and is really good at it. And we don't perceive what's in front of us. Some pretty major implications for how we approach marketing.
Yeah. So when there's the notion of gist perception coming from academia, which goes at the point that when we see an image for the first time, the brain wants to extract very quickly what is the gist of the image, basically. And so it actually gets this blurry resolution picture of what's out there so that it can quickly get a sense, is there something meaningful that I need to further process and further pay attention to? And our eyes will move around about the scene according to these processes that are largely unconscious, that we're largely not aware of doing. So that's the first image that actually pops into the brain, is this blurry image. And that means that we can actually look at our advertisements and ask, is this brain processing system that sees the world this way going to get our intended message in that very quick, brief instant, within less than 100 milliseconds with the information that we're trying to convey? And so you could look at this blurry image here and get that whole kind of picture. This is a piece of an ad, a still frame from an ad, and you can tell where it's coming from. You see the recognizable McDonald's fries with the logo, and you see that brown cardboard package that represents the shape of a hamburger.
We spend a lot of time talking about brand codes, things that are mental shortcuts for overall brand value. And this is one of those examples of what we mean, where images in this case are shortcuts where we see a portion of it and our brain fills in the rest of that story. We know what this is for, what it means, and what the overall context is. And in this case, it was obviously a quarter pounder with cheese.
Yeah, so this is a McDonald's ad where you can see that they took this property throughout every single frame. And what they did is they showed the meals that famous people would order at McDonald's.
McDonald's did a great job of doing two things. One, if you only give that ad a fraction of attention, you're immediately drawn in. It's got brand code, so you know immediately what it is. And then it's got a narrative structure that makes you want to see the rest of it. It continues to reveal. So it's a good way of both bringing you in that fraction, but keeping you there. But using brand codes is critical to long-term successful advertising. Take this image on the screen in front of you. You see a mountain. Immediately, you begin thinking, well, there's only a couple of things that this could be for. You probably have already landed on the right one, and you've already begun filtering of what the overall message that they're going to have with this when you realize it's an ad for Coors Light. So you probably don't even need to see the rest of the ad to know what it's going to do, but yet it has that same effect.
Yeah, so every single frame of the ad can be processed very quickly, even through pathways that get the gist of what you're seeing. And you can see that they've tied that imagery of the snowy mountain to the actual product by placing it on the product and the notion of refreshment, cold refreshment.
So taking small images, in this case, small components, making them clear at a distance is critical. And this is also true when we're shopping at point of purchase. You take this image right here, and I imagine, David, you immediately see your favorite pasta on the shelf, even without being able to see things like logos.
Yeah, that's how we'll tend to look at items at the grocery store. I could find my pasta there. I can also see the categories and get a sense for the different categories of items. And that's the other thing that you might look at with your materials is, can they detect the right category when they're looking for your category? So this clarity helps customers recognize your brand or product. And at the end of the day, this comes on you. This is your responsibility as a marketer. It's not the customer's responsibility. In the sense that if they don't recognize your advertisement, or if they can't find your product, they will happily pay attention to something else, or they will happily purchase another product that can satisfy their needs. You're the one who's at loss if they can't find it, in terms of the loss of sales that your company would experience.
Because every company that we've ever worked with wildly overestimates the brand loyalty that they have, regardless if it's a consumer packaged good or an exercise class or a service line.
Yeah, the second point is that recognition, again, is the first step of being noticed. But when the brain processes information through vision and the senses, this information is immediately tied to other brain areas that are involved in understanding what it is and creating associations between what that means to us. And that means that the imagery is actually an anchor for the sort of messages that you want to send. And that's what we'll be talking about next.
Tip number 2, making meaning. Now, what we're going to find here is the brain is desperate to understand what's going on. In fact, that is the primary filtering mechanism that it is going through when we encounter anything. It wants to understand what is happening. If it is new, unique, threatening, or of interest, we'll pay attention to it. If it's not in one of those categories, it filters it out so we don't even perceive it. So it is critical that all of our messaging leans into the brain's natural tendency to try to make meaning of things.
Yeah. So when we actually look at how people move their eyes about a scene, it turns out that we move our eyes rapidly, multiple times per second, often in the order of 100 milliseconds or shorter. And the guiding thing that guides our eye movements is that search for meaning. So if you look at an image and you think of all the things that you could be drawn to different segments of the image, whether it's like the contrast or the brightness, the key thing is actually the locations of the image that will give you the most understanding of what's present. And we're driven to look at this not at a conscious level. It's an unconscious thing that we naturally do, again, very quickly. And even if you ask people to look at an image and find the brightest spot or the biggest contrast, their eyes will still naturally move so that they can extract meaning from that image. And one of the key factors that drives that is that we want to make sense of what's out there. So if we can't make immediate sense of what we see, our eyes will fixate and be attached to whatever it is we're trying to understand until we can have some understanding of what it is.
We talk a whole lot about breaking cliches and the need to do that within our marketing. And this is the reason why. The brain filters out things that it understands because it doesn't need to give them mental processing resources. It focuses on the things it doesn't understand. These incongruous images we're obsessed with. What is going on here? How does that work? Your brain's trying to make meaning of it and decide, do I need to give this more thinking? And thus it focuses on those things. So this really leans into that whole concept of breaking cliches, because if the brain thinks it understands what it's going to see, you're likely going to be filtered out before it ever reaches to the level of perception.
Yeah. So when we look at this study here, they presented these ordinary images and then these incongruous images, which lean into that idea of unexpected and curiosity of trying to understand what it is. And when the brain processes these incongruous images, it will engage a bunch of additional brain areas, including these more frontal ones that are involved in motivation and action and executive function. It'll also spend more time looking at them, but we'll also remember those images more.
Great example of taking these concepts and doing something that is disruptive, that slightly confuses the brain, but then as it processes, it begins to make sense of the image. Now, if you've had Baby Bell, you recognize the pull strip as they wrap their cheese in this container that you can unwind, and it's conveying, hey, our product has a whole lot of milk in it. So what they're doing here is pulling you in with a slightly off-kilter image. Your brain is desperate to understand what's going on, and so you thought about it a little bit. And thinking about it is really the key factor here. Not only did you pay attention to it, but then you gave it precious mental processing power, which is what makes this ad so wildly effective.
Yeah, they extended their shape of their cheese into the shape of a milk carton. And I think it's interesting when we think about Skittles, the notion that what they've done is really smart and interesting. They've extended their product, which has the colors of the rainbow, into the notion of the rainbow. And that gets our attention and draws on all the associations that we have with what we think a rainbow represents and the feelings that we have behind a rainbow. So you probably remember this famous ad from Skittles where, if you have that idea of let's associate ourselves with the rainbow, you need to bring in that creative that can really drive home that point and make that association be clearly seen. That's what they did here.
Now, what's so great about this ad is it is very cognitively disruptive. From the moment you see this guy and he's got the flight hat on to planning of Skittles, your brain is desperate to try to understand what's going on in the ad until they get to the big reveal where they stitch together that brand narrative of it tasting like a rainbow. And not only have they got you to pay attention through making meaning and being disruptive, but they've stitched it into a brand story as well. And that's critically important because of the way our brain processes these mental associations.
Right. So, you can see what they're trying to do is associate the product with something that's abstract, like the rainbow and everything that we associate a rainbow with. With the hairdryer example here that comes from this article, they're showing that when you see that item, you're reminded of many different concepts, not really at a conscious level, but all these different brain areas that represent these array of concepts are slightly activated or slightly primed, and you will be more likely to think of them or process that information if you were to encounter it when you experience that item. And so when we try to understand the world and create meaning out of the world, we use that context and the surrounding information to do that. So on the left, you've got that hair dryer, and on the right, you've got the same image of a blurry, what looks like a drill. And the thing is, it's the same image, but it looks different depending on the context in which it appears, which shows how when we process the world, we integrate all this different information into how we experience it, and it shapes our perception.
I probably should have warned people these are intentionally blurry images and not to adjust your screen, but it's that context mattering that allows our brain to put lots more information into simple images that we see. For instance, the team executed these concepts against Rita's Italian Ice. They're trying to really create that association of an Italian masterpiece. So adding the association, adding the context of known Italian famous pieces, including Statue of David here with a clever leaf covering up his bits for America, allows them to lean into those already existing associations. So split second of processing, you get lots more information because of the way that we put context in it. And that allows the brain to make meaning.
Yeah, and it helps us understand how unique Rita's Italian Ice really is as a product.
Now, the brain loves to make meaning, and it leans into when it's confused. So these are some concepts the team did for St. Vincent's 119. It was a wellness facility that includes doctor's offices, wellness activities, a gym. They use that incongruence to get the brain to lean in. So you see somebody here in a workout outfit having blood pressure taken, or somebody in a cast having their nails done. And it makes you wonder what's going on, which dramatically increases the likelihood that you're going to process not only the image, but the content associated with it, because the brain is desperate to make meaning of what it sees.
Yeah, so we're making meaning, and we use these associations and the context to convey information. So as we showed, it could be just product information like 98% milk, or it could be brand related information like taste the rainbow.
So tip number 3 is to be motivating. Now, this sounds like generic sort of advice for marketing, but it really is a very persuasive way of thinking about our own marketing. So let's take this a step deeper, Dr. Dave.
Yeah, it's understanding the motivations of your audience, and recognizing that when we actually process the world, we process it in the context of these aspirational things like our goals and our motivations. So this image shows how visual information goes throughout the brain within 100 milliseconds. So on the left, there's an early visual response. That's entirely the visual scene. But the point is that very quickly, that information that you see goes beyond the brain area that's dedicated to vision and throughout into the frontal brain areas, because we want to not just see it, but we want to understand what is the motivation, how does it align with our motivations, and how does it align with our goals. So that's embedded in how we process information, and it helps us impart motivations and meaning and narratives on things that we observe. As we see in this famous study from Hyder and Simmel, where if all you do is you look at these symbols and the way they interact with each other, you can see that there's quite a story going on.
What's really fascinating about this is how you just process it. Now, we've just got geometric shapes moving somewhat randomly around a screen, but most people, when they view this, think, wow, that red triangle was super aggressive, and that blue triangle came along and saved that ball and helped him escape. And it was your brain trying to come up with meaning, motivation behind what it's seeing and turn it into a narrative structure, because that's critical to how we process information. Even if you don't provide it, this is going to happen because it's a subconscious process. And on that last slide, you saw it occurred in less than 100 milliseconds. So this is happening regardless of whether or not you define it. So you better define it. Otherwise, the brain's going to stitch it together for you. Great example of this is Volvo. Volvo, of course, is all about safety. This image you process super quickly, and typically the brain looks at it and goes, oh, that was a crash, but look at that space where I would be. Wow, that looks awful secure. Therefore, this must be a safe environment. And then the copy pays that off. We design every Volvo to look like this. So your brain is processing and giving meaning and motivation to that image. It's the old picture's worth 1,000 words, right, Dave?
Yeah, it's very powerful. And you want to make sure that you have a clear understanding of the message and the meaning that you want to articulate. In particular, the motivations of the customer. And so in our work with Troy University here, we really focused on the idea that there's this universal thing where when people are growing up, they'll have dreams about what they aspire to be, and they want to make change, and they want to be a leader. And so we want to lean into that universal thing that we experience and call on that, because it's a highly motivating thing that many people have. So we use that to guide our lead change campaign. And if you we'll take a look at this commercial, and you'll see that this notion of aspiring to make change and lead and recognizing your childhood dreams is embedded throughout the entire commercial, within every frame, thinking about all those processes that we've been talking about.
We all dream. We dream when we're sleeping, when we're awake. But dreams quickly become distant memories, unless we do something about it. Push ourselves. Believe in something. Do everything in our power. Direct every action and thought we have to learn to lead, to make it real. At Troy University, we offer leadership opportunities from day one. We're dedicated to teaching a new generation to lead change. Do you have what it takes to change the world?
I love this ad for a variety of reasons. It's heavy with emotional motivation. It's got a great narrative arc. But the beauty of this is it allows the viewer to put themselves in the ad. They can think about when they were that age and had those motivations and see what it takes to get there. And they use subtle techniques all throughout the ad to let the brain know what's going on. In this case, you probably noticed lots of people looking upward within the ad. And that's because mentally, when we think about dreaming, when we think about aspiration, we have a tendency to look up. So as you are daydreaming, you will unconsciously look up. So subtle cues like this tell the brain what's going on and how to interpret what's happening. Just like those little balls moving around on the screen, your brain stitched into a story. The little cues within the ad are very meaningful here as well.
Yeah, and this image here is one of my favorites in terms of really bringing everything together. When we think about what the eye is doing when it sees it is curiosity of a child and then this body. And so you're going to be fixating to try to understand what is that and create meaning, where you'll see that it's an astronaut. And when you make that connection between the child and his dreams and leading change, that's all embedded within this image, which is, of course, the message that we want to send. When you really embrace this idea and what you care about, then you can go out into the world and really make it come to life, like what we did here, where we sent out a dream advisor to a baseball game to help people interpret their dreams and see how Troy University is a place where they can go to align with leadership and making change.
Small triggers, making meaning, and building brand assets through brand codes. Great way of showing that you can bring all this together, and it doesn't have to just be an ad. There are lots of ways to use marketing and creative ways to get messages in front of people. And this is yet another tremendous example
Yeah, and we know that our audience is on certain platforms, like TikTok is really popular. And so, we're going out there and we're getting on TikTok, and we're seeing that, when these students and when are seeing the advertisement, the message is coming through that this is about their dreams, as you can see in this TikTok. Yeah, so the whole motivation behind this is that we're always seeking goals. As we talked about, we're always exploring and understanding the world in terms of our motivations. And that means that when you align with motivations and goals in your messaging, then you have the ability to align with a much larger number of people and engage them. Because fundamentally, we seek goals, but we don't go out seeking product descriptions.
Yeah, and maybe a few people do. Like if you're heavy into shopping and you're trying to evaluate things, you might lean into some of those things, but that's not how the vast majority of us are processing information. But yet marketers have a tendency to want to go deep very, very quickly. We want to talk about ourselves, our products, our services, and the tangible outcomes as opposed to the goals and benefits of those outcomes, which is how people are processing information. So what happens when we do that? Well, the brain ignores us, because that's not relevant to the consumer at the point of opportunity. And that goes back to the concept of being motivating, talking to what people are interested in consuming as opposed to what you're interested in saying.
Right. So, one of the take homes here is simply that we are going to impart meaning and a narrative to what we experience. And it's your job to create the narrative and meaning that you want your customer to see.
Let's get into number 4, and that's where the little things matter. Now, I'm sure you picked up bits and pieces of this in some of our other examples, but every successful piece of marketing focuses on a lot of the little things because the brain is processing a lot of those little things at a subconscious level to create meaning, to derive motivation, to decide if it wants to pay attention to it at all, far more than perhaps you gave credit to those things. So let's focus on some of these a little bit, Dave.
Yeah, so we talked about how it's so automatic that we try to understand what's happening in the world. And we know that this is a framework that has been already talked about in the world of marketing in the distinction between the system 1 and system 2, which helps us appreciate the notion of system 1 helps us appreciate the fact that the majority of information and the way that we engage in the world is automatic. It's as if we're on autopilot and we're not thinking too much about what we're doing. And so very intuitive and instinctive and difficult to articulate is basically how we extract information from the world. And I talked about it here in terms of implicit and explicit. All of that implicit information is that kind of complicated information that conveys things that we don't necessarily, and we aren't able to necessarily verbally talk about.
And it's funny because we talk about thinking, and when we talk about thinking, we really mean that intentional thinking where you're cognitively engaged, but the brain is processing lots of stuff precognitively, and it gives a lot more weight to the things that it sees non-verbally than it does the verbal descriptions. Like in this example, somebody says yes, but they're shaking their head no. What are you going to think they really mean? Well, chances are, if you're like most people, you override what they said and you focus on that body language of what's coming across. So this is fundamentally true in an obvious example like this, but it's true in lots of smaller, more subtle ways.
Yeah, I really like this example from Lean Cuisine, where they are offering 20% more food. And this goes against you have two conflicting pieces of information here. The notion of lean invokes ideas of being skinny, maybe working out, eating healthy, and it certainly doesn't invoke ideas of eating more food. So when you encounter that 20% more, it invokes ideas of, gaining weight, maybe eating irresponsibly. These two things conflict.
Yeah, and they could have gone about this in lots of other ways, but they're leaning into that natural system where our brain goes, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. I'm not going to pay attention to one of the things that you're saying here. And unfortunately for Lean Cuisine, they're probably not paying attention to the lean portion of their message. We saw this in another famous ad from a couple of years ago. Burger King briefly ran this ad on one outdoor board. Now, it was done mostly so that the creative folks could submit it for the national and international awards, and they did. And they actually did reasonably well. However, Burger King was smart enough not to run this ad more widespread. Now, you've likely seen it if you're watching this webinar, because they got to be somewhat famous within the industry. But what's going on here is when the brain sees this, what does it process? Ugh, oh my God, that's disgusting. And because of our emotional memory, that's what we remember. Like, oh, disgusting, Burger King. It sees this and remembers disgust, and then it stores disgust associated with Burger King. As a result, it didn't sell many hamburgers. That may have won some marketing awards, but as we have seen, marketing awards have a really low relationship with business outcomes. I think it's a tremendous example of that implicit processing that's going on that overrides whatever the creatives hoped was going to occur.
So we make sure to have a single message and be clear on that message, and that all those subtle cues that people get from all of the imagery that surrounds it are lined up with each other so that they really have a full understanding of what's trying to be communicated. You have consistency between the implicit and the explicit. At Intermark Group, we call this process simple distinction, and it is about being simply distinct and fighting for that single-minded idea that you want the customer to perceive, because then it has a more solid place in the brain, it's more clearly perceived, and we can be more thoughtful about the associations that we want to attach to it.
And remember, this is about your brand. The short answer to the question, why you? What makes you distinct? And rarely is it a functional answer. It needs to be a goal answer. It needs to align with the motivation of consumers. And that's the tough part for most of us in finding ways to differentiate what we do, which is often very similar to what our competitors offer, in a way that is relevant to consumers. And that's why this is so hard. And that's why so many companies struggle with it or just fail to attack it at all. But there's a very tight relationship between being good at this distinction and sticking with a point of distinction and your long-term sales. And there's a really famous examples from our friends at Michelob. Hopefully we picked an example long ago enough that no one's going to get upset about it. But this is a good example where they had a really strong brand, had a great point of differentiation, had great sales associated with it, and then began to monkey with it. They monkeyed with it so much that the wheels fell off. Now, if you are old enough, you might remember with where you're going, it's Michelob. And at the time, sales were booming, man. But that wasn't good enough. The various ad folks came along, changed the message a whole number of times. How about weekends? We'll try to own weekends. Weekends are made for Michelob. Well, that wasn't good enough for them. Well, they changed it a little bit. How about we extend the weekend to the rest of the week? So put a little weekend within your week. So, okay, you can see that slight shift, but we're pretty long way away. Well, now, no, we want to own night. So the night belongs to Michelob. They even had a famous song kind of associated with this, that they spent so much money, got some brand traction. Well, what happens in the brain? It's that point of simple distinction, the little things that become confused. Was it about some days? Was it about good days? Was it about weekends? Was it about evenings? Was it about making the week part of your weekend? Lots of messaging going on here, and the brain struggles to do anything with it. And we use that information subconsciously to make that purchase decision. Now, this applies certainly in products, but it also applies in services and B2B and everywhere else. So, David, What was the story here with sales?
Oh, not super great. So 8.1 million barrels was the peak of 1980. And as these campaigns rolled out over many years with the confusing language, it was down to 1.8 million in 1998.
Owning your brand, being consistent about it, and having that strong point of distinction so that when you see a simple image, see a brand code, it begins to resonate.
Just like Coors did, yeah.
So when you want mountain cold refreshment, that's where it sticks. Now, the most important part of this is that it works. Brands who have a weak point of differentiation, that don't have simple distinction, can be successful, but they pale in comparison to the brands that have spent energy to have a strong point of differentiation. Over 300% improvement in long-term performance. I don't know about you, but if somebody told me I could grow my company 3 times as fast by doing this one simple thing, sounds clickbaity, but man, it works, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's pretty difficult. You got to be very thoughtful, as we talked about here, about how the little things matter. And you have to get noticed first and foremost, as we also talked about here. And then, beyond getting noticed, having that strong, meaningful difference is an important thing.
And unfortunately, we see a whole lot of advertising out there that focuses on the content of the ad as opposed to tying things together with that meaning, tying things together with that point of distinction, focusing on being funny as opposed to delivering something that is relevant to the consumers to get noticed. So as we recap these things to get noticed, how do we be in that 16% of ads that are remembered? You start by getting noticed, and you do this by being clear at a distance, having those brand codes and establishing them in such a way so when people see it, they know it's you. We lean into the brain's need to make meaning, and we do that by being disruptive, breaking cliches, and having some things to trick people into thinking. Number three, we lean into natural human motivation of communicating in ways that are relevant to how the consumer is processing their own world. So not facts and features about our product, but how it's going to benefit the consumer. And then lastly, we realize that the little things matter a whole lot. Everything from what people are doing within the ads, the subconscious messaging that we are putting into the ads, but also that point of distinction that ought to be the centerpiece of all of our marketing. All of those things will help you stand out so that people pay attention to your ads in the first place. So a lot of information. And we're skimming the surface on a lot of this, in fairness. So let's give you a framework to help you apply this to your own marketing. So a handful of easy steps. You can take this checklist, and next time you're evaluating an ad and you've been staring at it for too long, you don't know if it's successful, let's try to put it in context. So don't just view the ad as a printout in your hand. Let's put it in context. If it's a banner display, load it into a page with other content on a banner. If it's going to be a TV ad, watch it in context of a show where it pops up and you see it within context of other ads. Don't just view it by itself. Putting it in context will allow you to see it as your consumer is going to see it. And you'll be surprised at what pops when you do it that way. Because even if you don't want to, you'll process it like this. Number two, blur it a little bit or only allow somebody to see it super quickly. Do we have the brand codes in there that allow people to know what the context is, what the category is, and what that point of differentiation is? It's going to really wake you up to what your brand codes are and how effective you are about using those brand codes. Then you can simply ask people, well, what does this make you think about? What does this make you remember? What does it trigger? And all of a sudden you're going to see what mental associations you're accidentally leaning into, because we do that a lot. We don't think about what other areas this is going to trigger. And that's what happens when, or how we get to a point where we're putting a moldy hamburger on an outdoor board, because we're not thinking about those mental associations. Number four, try to think about the key motivation that you're solving for the consumer. What is that point of meaning that we're trying to solve? And let's get away from the features and benefits that we love to put out there. And number five is the motivation or goal linked to the brand. And this is a major point of failure where we have two ideas and we never stitch them together. Your brand, your product, your service has to be linked inextricably to that point of motivation. If it is not, the brain's not going to make that leap for you. And then lastly, can it be something that we own? Is it unique to us? And that comes back to that point of simple distinction, the why us. It has to be distinct from everybody else. It doesn't have to be uniquely true, but we've got to own it enough so that nobody else can claim it, much like Volvo has owned safety. And no matter that Nissan spent over $1 billion trying to unseat them from the safety top of the food chain, they're unable to change pretty much anybody's mind because it's such a resilient position to be in. So use this checklist. It will help you determine very quickly, will your ad break through that proverbial clutter, be paid attention to in the first place? And if it is, you're on your way to being part of that 16% that people remember. We cover this and a lot of other content regularly in our blogs and in the CMO Minute that we put out once a week. So if you're not following those, go to our website and sign up. You can see all the old blogs there, and we'll send you a weekly email with a 1-minute digestible chunk of research and psychology overview. If you have some questions, please put them in the Q&A and the chat function below. And if you have things you just want to chat about and you want to nerd out about psychology and advertising, send me an email. I would love nothing more than to talk to some of you about what's going on with your brands and your products and how to make them more effective. I thoroughly enjoy this conversation with the folks who reach out on a regular basis. So thank you for that. It does make my day. Got one question here, and they want to know, what of these is the single most important? Whew. You know, and I would argue that it's probably a tie between having that point of simple distinction and the brand codes. I can't overstate how important those simple pieces of imagery that you see and immediately process and know that, yes, this is that brand, and letting the brain do the rest of the work for you without needing to see the entire ad to know what's going on. Those are the biggest mistakes that we see out there, people not distinguishing themselves and then not having brand codes that they're leaning into on a regular basis. Question just came in from Scott. He asks, is there any particular codes that are important to mobile ads? And I'm assuming, Scott, you mean mobile ads, both in terms of text messages, but also more importantly, ads that are served on mobile devices, which, as everybody knows, are becoming increasingly important as people are doing a lot more of their processing and research and shopping and just even watching video in the online space. The things that we see that are particularly effective in terms of brand codes, we see characters, spokespeople, logos, audio mnemonics, visual devices that we can replay over and over again, like the mountains for Coors or like the French fry box for McDonald's, are all particularly effective. Now, in mobile, people have a slightly shorter attention span, but the same drivers have that effect. We still want to put images in front of people that immediately trigger that full thought process, that make people want to pay attention to the rest of the ads. So go ahead and define what your brand codes are going to be, and those are going to live across all platforms. Now, you'll notice I gave a fairly long list, and that's not even an exhaustive list by any means, but you need to define which ones you're going to try to use consistently. The bigger brands have lots of brand codes and lots of mental associations that they can lean into. But if you need at least some, even if you were just getting started, and things that you can own.
Well, there's a question about how you figure out what your brand codes are.
How do you figure out what your brand codes are?
And there's two key things, which is, do they recognize that it's you, and do they confuse it with other competitors? So it needs to be uniquely seen as two survey questions. How many recognize that it's part of your brand? And then how confusing is it in terms of how many other brands do they associate with that code?
That's right. And your brand codes you define, and you need to be intentional about them. In a recent blog post, I'll try to highlight that when we send out the email follow-up. It's a pretty well-researched topic about which brand codes are most effective, or what type of brand codes are most effective. But you need to be very disciplined about defining those. If you need help with that, send me an email. I'll help you walk through that process. But if you're not intentionally defining your brand codes, then you're doing marketing wrong. And that's a strong statement, but I feel pretty strongly about it. Just be intentional and be consistent. All right. I think that is our time for today. Thank you so much, everybody. It was good being here, and I look forward to hearing from some of you in the days to come. We will send out links to download and watch this, as well as the deck. You can get all of these at our website ahead of time at intermarkgroup.com. Until then, we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.